Hello? Yes. Okay, if everyone has their lunch and has taken a seat on the orange stairs, we can start. Yes. At first, welcome everyone to the BAU opening lecture, the first BAU event of this year. My name is Christel, and together with the rest of the BAU committee, we've organized several workshops, lectures, and events this month, every Wednesday to be precise, to connect students and companies. So just come by every Wednesday in the lunch and the afternoon. We usually have events. And we will start this month off with an opening lecture by Peter Veenstra from LOLA Landscape Architects. And he will tell us all something about the Architecture Biennale of 2022 called It's About Time. So I'll give the word to Peter now. Thank you. There's a bit of technical difficulty. But
There. Yes.
Yes.
Hey. Good afternoon. Thanks for showing up today. My name is Peter Veenstra. I'm partner at LOLA Landscape Architects in Rotterdam. Today, I'm not going to talk about our projects, but about the architecture biennial that took place last year, of which I was one of the 4 curators. It was called It's About Time, the Architecture of Change. It was on invitation of Saskia van Stijn, who is the new director of the IABR, the International Architecture Biennale Rotterdam. And next to me, she also invited Lea-Katrien Tjatska, Dirk Loorbach, and Veronique Pateel. So it was a multidisciplinary team. Me as a landscape architect, Lea-Katrien and Veronique as architectural historians, and Dirk Loorbach as a transition scientist. So we were bringing together these different perspectives to talk about and think about contemporary architecture. Big part of organizing Architecture Biennial is to come up with a topic and to write the first page of text, and you're always in a line of earlier events that took place, either in Rotterdam or elsewhere in the world. And of course you want to come up with a new topic, something that has never been talked about before. Yet this time we felt it was incredibly important to talk about climate change and the role of the architect in this, which is not at all a unique topic, but it's too important to not talk about it. But we felt, let's contribute to, let's say, this discussion and add a new angle. It was 2022, and what was interesting for us is that it was exactly 50 years after the publication of Limits to Growth, and we took that as a point of departure. Limits to Growth is a publication that was commissioned by the Club of Rome, and this was a group of industrials, thinkers, politicians, scientists that were concerned with the environment and the future of our planet. And they hired MIT to do a study on the future development of humanity. And what they did, they built a what they called the world model. It was also the 70s, time of thinking big. And this was the first attempt to predict, let's say, behavior of society according to a number of parameters. And to build a complex model in which these different parameters are actually interacting with each other. And to basically analyze a complex system and use it to, let's say, look into the future. And what they did for this study is they took 5 parameters that were very relevant for the future of mankind. And they were, let's say, trying to predict or forecast how these parameters would develop over time. This was, first of all, population growth, linked to that food production, industrial output, pollution, and resource extraction. These were the 5 parameters. And they were researching 12 different scenarios of how the future could unfold. And in most of these scenarios, they ran into the problem that our society is based on a growth model. So we want to get better each year. We want to get a little richer each year. If you have a company, there's always sort of an annual revenue that you have as a target. And this leads to exponential growth. This very principle of exponential growth is bound to, at a certain moment, hit a ceiling and lead to big trouble, you could say. So in all these different scenarios, in the end, there was a moment that was just simply too much pollution and food scarcity, resource scarcity. And they published this in the book Limits to Growth, which was translated into many different languages, published all around the world, and it had a huge impact in the, let's say, environmental awareness of people all around the world. Now, what's a very shocking fact is that only 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, University of Melbourne analyzed actually how the real development of these parameters was over time. And what they found out that actually from the 12 scenarios that the MIT was researching, the worst case scenario became a reality. And this is the, let's say, the scenario in which we do absolutely nothing to stop this disaster to happen. So here you can see, let's say, the predicted lines and the continuous lines, so the real development of these different parameters. Here, so that's from this study, and here you see another graph. This is the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere over time, and pinpointed different moments that large events were organized to do something about it. And it's a bit suggestive, but you can see that till so far we didn't really manage to have an impact. And we are all convinced that we have to really step off business as usual. The abbreviation is BAU, same as for this week. And find different ways to live and to organize ourselves, and also for us to be an architect. Yet we find ourselves many times in this position. This is a photo of the Great Green Belt in China. It's a sort of a forest belt meant to stop desertification. And you can see that it's not really working till so far. And yeah, sometimes we feel like one of these guys sweeping the road, somehow dealing with the consequences, but not really able to stop climate change or to have a meaningful impact. So we said for this biannual, let's take it as a point of departure. 50 years after Limits to Growth, we look at the role of architecture and the role of, or let's say, the aspect of time in this. Time in the sense of what can we learn if we look back in time, if we look into the far future, So we expand our time horizon, but also if we think of, let's say, different velocities at which we can think and act. We found a great locations for this. The Ferrodome in Rotterdam, it's a former gasometer. So somehow a ruin of the fossil economy, completely empty and abandoned. And we took this as a sort of a fantastic dome to present architectural work. We invited graphic designer Stahl R. from Berlin that made, I think, a very nice graphic design based on warning signals, hazard symbols, and combined them into sort of collages that had a sort of a hopeful appearance. Presented in the Biennale itself, but also on other places like here at Rotterdam Central Station. And we worked with a scenographer, Richard Van Lut, that we asked to create a exhibition design that with a very low carbon footprint, because we thought we were obliged to not just show projects, let's say good examples, but also try to be a good example in how we organize this, this exhibition. So basically everything in that exhibition is sold afterwards, so returned to the market or been reused in a different way. And here you see sort of an image of this dome and the works of over 50 architects, either existing work or commissioned work and research brought all together. Very important element of this exhibition was a timeline of climate awareness, and I started my talk with talking about the Club of Rome and limits to growth, and basically we spent quite some time on analyzing how the environmental awareness started to exist and how it developed over time, and what the responses were in politics, in society, in popular culture, and in architecture. And it was on these big, shiny walls, sort of as a sort of a backbone in the exhibition. And even though 1972 is a very important moment, this environmental awareness already started earlier. Basically, you could say in the protest generation, the hippies in the 60s. And a very important moment was the book Silent Spring from Rachel Carson. The publication of that really also had a big effect. And many activists also refer to this moment as a sort of their start of thinking about the environment. And this was a book about the effect of pesticides in agriculture and the effect on nature. It was also a time that first architectural experiments were taking place, born out of a concern with the environment and our footprint on this planet. And here you see Drop City, sort of experimental new ways of living in a sort of igloo domes, very alternative scene. And what we can see anyway throughout, let's say, this whole timeline is that over and over there were, let's say, new architectural experiments that usually first failed and then got repeated and eventually some of them grew to become the new standard. So it's interesting to follow some of these lines back to the very first origin. But it's also really highlighted the importance of experiment, of which mostly the first experiment is always looks in a way a bit hopeless, but very important. And then in the 70s, already 2 years before this publication, there was the first Earth Day, sort of very large manifestation in the States to focus on environmental issues. And it was a huge success, and it has been repeated many times after. In 71, activism got a new face thanks to Greenpeace. This was this organization started in '71 with the boat called Greenpeace. And in '72 there was the first climate conference in Stockholm, the only One Earth conference. What also happened or helped, let's say, feeding this concern for, let's say, our effect on the planet was the oil crisis in the 1970s. There was, let's say, a first moment people started to realize that the modernistic system we built was also had its vulnerabilities, and yeah, it can be also finite. Moments of hope in politics. So this was a very interesting moment in 1979 when in the States, actually, let's say this concern for the environment that was basically a sort of a grassroots development was also adopted by the government. Jimmy Carter placing solar panels in front of the White House as a sort of important symbol, and combining this with a ambition to go solar. And I think, what was it? It was like 20% in the year 2000. Still, let's say, not super ambitious, but it was a great symbolic step. But you can also, let's say, directly see the counter response to this. When Reagan got in power 2 years later, first thing he did was take out the solar panels. Not that they were not functioning, they were fine. It was just to bring a new narrative to the White House, and this was of, let's say, relentless growth as the only economic growth as the only principle. Yeah, let's say from then on you can see that sort of there were these clearly two powers. On the one hand, sort of the economically driven politicians and scientists also, and companies, and on the other hand, the people concerned with the environment. And this has always been a sort of a battle, you could say. An interesting moment was in '89 in Noordwijk. There was a global conference, and there we have been very close to get something similar to the Paris agreements in from 2015. And it was very last minute. It didn't happen because the United States pulled back because of the industrial lobby, and then basically we had to wait for another 25 years for, let's say, this to happen. Slowly, let's say, this concern for the environment shifted towards also, let's say, the focus on carbon. Of course, also thanks to a growing research body of work in research, and a better understanding of how climate change works. And here we see another early example or experiment of an attempt to make a carbon neutral city. So this is by Foster Design, Master City. Also this one miserably failed in the end. As you can see, it was the idea to really build a whole energy neutral city and carbon neutral city. In the end, all what's built are these solar panels, and they're also disconnected. Now we're getting closer to the present. Everybody knows this moment, the international agreement, the Paris agreements. And this is a sort of a great milestone in this timeline, and of course also something that we still feel as a sort of bedrock moment that still, let's say, drives a lot of the policy changes that are taking place right now. And very recent, we, let's say, the urgency of all of this was raised even more because of environmental or climate disasters that we could see in the news all over the world, floodings, droughts, combined with the pandemic that also, of course, showed the vulnerability of a globalized world. That accelerated actually the thinking on climate change. And we say that right now we are in a sort of transition moment where, let's say, all the conditions are there to actually make a change happen. So to turn that graph into a different direction that I showed earlier. In transition theory, you need three things for to get to real change. One is to feel, let's say, have the urgency, to have the awareness. Second is to feel the urgency, and the third is to have the opportunity. And if you look at that whole timeline, started from 72, you can question, like, why did nothing happen? Why didn't we change the curve earlier? But we feel we needed all this time to build up that urgency, sense of urgency, share this feeling of awareness with everyone, and to also develop the tools and the science to actually have the opportunity to really change things. In the exhibition, we also didn't just show work, but we also invited different municipalities and governmental entities to workshop with us to think about a radical different future. That happened here. There's sort of a center space in the exhibition, and to think with them about radical transitions when it comes to related to climate change, so the mobility transition, energy transition, were some of the topics that we have been discussing there. Here one photo, and what was a sort of in the background of that workshop space was this X-curve. This is, I think, a very interesting diagram that shows how transitions take place. So transitions are sort of big systemic changes. And what you see here are, let's say, basically two directions, one going down, one going up. And you could say that these are the powers that be, that over time lose momentum, and when circumstances change, can destabilize to end up in sort of a state of chaos, to then completely break down and be phased out, while other new initiatives start as an experiment, some of which get accelerated and scaled up to enter the same chaotic moment where they can emerge and eventually institutionalize, stabilize, and become the new standard. Very simple example is the gasoline car that started, of course, as the only standard we had, and the electric car that started with some first experiments. And yeah, through a couple of steps, we can see how now the gasoline car gets phased out and the electric car becomes the new standard. Well, this principle, these steps happen in each aspect of our built environment, basically. And so if we want to grow towards climate neutral society, we have to undergo all these steps. And so it's good to also realize it and also position yourself where you are and where you feel you are and where you want to go to. we did this exercise with a lot of participants of these workshops, and we found that a lot of people, let's say, recognize this moment of chaos and emergence, where we see that, let's say, the old structures are being broken down, have difficulties to continue their operations, while, let's say, the new alternatives are getting now really serious and are on their way to become the new standard. What's interesting about that moment of chaos is that no one knows where the future exactly lies. So where before things were much more predictable, we kind of knew, we could predict much easier how the world would look in 10 years. This is, at this moment, very difficult. And so it's very hard to make plans, in a way. And one of the things we learned is that it's actually impossible to predict what's going to happen. The best thing we can all do is to formulate together what we think is the most desirable future and to work towards that. So to be as clear as you can, to be as outspoken as you can, and to try to influence, let's say, this cloud of actors in this chaotic situation, to move towards the most desirable future. Now, this is sort of broad theoretic story. Now I will go more towards the role of the architect in this. And because that was an important question for us, is like, how can you as an architect act in this moment if you are also concerned with the future of our planet? And we live in a very special moment. We understand the urgency, there is momentum, but it's also very hard to operate because the time pressure is so high. Not only do we live in an age of acceleration and are things going very fast in general, and it's very hard to, let's say, have an impact if you have to always deliver your next design in a couple of weeks. But also the time pressure to actually act upon climate change and to change the curve. But this was a very important question for us. So architects need to recalibrate, and we asked ourselves what form of recalibration is most interesting but also most productive, and how can we accelerate transition. And for that we formulated 3 positions that you can take as an architect that are productive, and that's the activist, the ancestor, and the accelerator. And in the exhibition, 50% of it was basically gathering work of architects and other professionals that we found inspiring as examples for these different attitudes. Each of these attitudes also has a different velocity, different speed at which you interact and act. So the activist is the first one, and this is someone that really lives in the here and now and doesn't wait for change to take place in 10 years, but wants to have effect tomorrow. He tries to sort of intervene and to hack the system in a way, and to influence through interventions either in media or in space. What's also very important is the activist. Is that the activist has a social agenda. Very often, especially as architects, we can see climate change as a technical problem, but in the end, it's very important to think about the social dimensions. In the end, we are transforming the system that we live and work in. And the question is, how will this, let's say, new system also distribute wealth and opportunities? For, let's say, these different parts of the exhibition, we always also invited one architect group to make a big installation as a sort of a center point of this, of that part. And for the activist, it was Encore Heureux, and we invited them to do a small research on this topic. They came up with an installation where they gathered, let's say, very simply put, good news and bad news. It's this construction with depictions, and there was a sort of a legend linked to it, of facts that lead to despair, that make you lose hope, basically, that confirm this idea that the world is going to hell. And on the other side, they actually gathered hopeful initiatives that they could find in France and outside of France. It's an office from Paris. And if you see those all together, and then actually you start to feel quite positive about what we can do and how we can change the world. And what they said, if you want to engage with this topic, you have to allow these two forces always to interact with each other. So on the one hand, feel the despair and feel the urgency. And on the other hand, always find energy. And they thought hope was not the right word, because that maybe is a bit naive, but at least find energy to do something about it and never lose that energy. And we thought it was very interesting. So this is really the sort of the two creative forces, let's say, for designers to act. We also invited Extinction Rebellion, because we said, okay, if architects should be more activistic, what can they learn? And they actually organized workshops for architects how to be a better activist, which was very interesting. And we asked them the question, what can architects do for you? Because, I mean, these are, of course, they are pure activists. What we started to do is to build up a first archive. It's a very young organization. They're only 4 years old, and completely decentralized, organizing actions in let's say, a new way. Yet they still build up material that they want to keep and somehow preserve. And so this was the first attempt, let's say, to build up this archive for them with their best costumes, posters, props for how to organize the demonstrations, etc. For each of the attitudes, we also wondered what kind of architecture it produces. And when it comes to the activist, everybody intuitively feels that it's a bit of this do-it-yourself appearance, and it's sort of a low-cost, temporary type of architecture. We found it's very interesting in this research. It's coming from TU Delft, from 3 people, Rick de Brouwer, Frieda Vogler, and Irena Prados. They were observing a group of protesters next to a coal mine in Germany. You may have all heard of it in the news. And they started actually to live in a forest just next to this coal mine to stop the further expansion of this coal mine. We found it beautiful, let's say, the architecture it produced, but moreover, what we also thought is important is that not building and not developing is also a very important choice that sometimes needs to be made. And this is also sort of, let's say, an activistic choice that also you as architects can make. And we can see that these kind of actions are actually quite, can be very successful and impactful. In the end, they have been all taken out of this forest. But for instance, in France, you have a similar movement that with success really stopped a lot of developments that were planned on sensitive nature areas and so on. The activist approach is also to look at not only the Western world, but also look at the poorer parts of the world and to think low budget. In the end, the effects of climate change predominantly end up in the parts where people have least money. And if we want to solve it, we have to come up with solutions that work under such circumstances, with less political stability and with less money. And this was a very interesting study from MIT. They developed a toolkit to for all the former Soviet Union apartment blocks to be transformed on a do-it-yourself basis. What happened there is that these were all collective apartment blocks that were privatized, given to all the residents after the Wende. But these people, most of them didn't really have the money to actually maintain their home. And if you think of it now, going through the energy transition, there is no money there to make this happen. So this is an attempt to, let's say, in a very low budget way, with the circumstances in this part of the world, still make this transition happen. And another example of that is a project from OO's office from Rotterdam that has been working for years on the favelas in Brazil to implement a sustainable water system. So to take, let's say, river water, clean river water, use it for the informal settlements, for laundry and for drinking, then to filter it, clean it, and give it back to the system as a sort of a sustainable principle. And they really went there to try to really implement this and build first prototypes, as you can see here. A last thing about to say about the activistic approach is that we also found two examples of, let's say, not letting go for a long time. Many of these activistic offices need a long time to go from the margin and from the sort of a niche situation to grow to become what we could say in this X-curve diagram, to become a new standard. And a great example of this is Superuse Studios. They started as 2012, that was their name, before 2012. And they were always focused on circular architecture in a time that no one was thinking about it. And I remember very well that they started with very small experimental projects of building a playground out of wind turbine blades and things like that. But always addressing this topic about the importance to close the cycles of material in our building production. And what happened is that in these 25 years, they managed to, let's say, draw the lessons from all their perspectives and become consultants for absolutely mainstream projects, and also to help writing the new legislation and the new standards for circular architecture. So they managed to go from absolutely niche to mainstream in 25 years. So if you take this activistic approach, don't lose hope, and just stick to what you're doing for a long time. Second approach is of the ancestor. And we took this title from a book, 5 minutes, a book called The Good Ancestor from Roman Krznaric, and it is basically a plea for long-term thinking. So the ancestor, let's say, takes the slowest approach, looks very far back in time and very far into the future, not to change things tomorrow, but to sort of radically change direction to end up in a much better place in the far future. And this is about materials used in architecture, how we work with labor. We had a pavilion designed by Anupama Kundu built by TU Delft. It's about rethinking the way we live and how we, for instance, organize the climate in our house. Maybe not all rooms of the house need to be climatized. And what we saw is that this sort of, let's say, more fundamental approach is actually successful at this moment on all scale levels. So this is an example of sort of a large-scale project in Antwerp, over the ring, where the whole ring road of Antwerp is going underground to make place for a large park. This is a project that would have never succeeded 20 years ago, but it seems there is momentum right now to also on this scale radically rethink the way the city relates to infrastructure and relates to nature. And the largest scale project that we had in this exhibition was from Richard Weller. It was called The World Park, and it's a global strategy for nature conservation. A fantastic idea. Richard Weller is working at UPenn, and he came up with the idea to create sort of global corridors for wildlife and nature that also allow species to travel while climate change takes place and climate zones are slowly shifting. And to combine this also with this leisure concept. This was never meant to sort of be executed one by one. It's more a plea for global collaboration on conservation. However, they have been successful also with this project because now they have been commissioned by the UN to further elaborate this work. I'll skip this because of time and go to the third one, the accelerator. And the accelerator is the person that actually accepts the system as it is and tries to, let's say, stay in the speed at which we are acting today and go even faster with the solutions as the problems occur. We had one research done by MLA Plus where they gathered all the patents that were coined for climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and they showed this sort of hopeful cloud of solutions that of course also emerged while at the same time the problems of climate change manifested themselves more clearly. Also, let's say a fantastic example is a book of Vincent van der Meulen, Kraaivanger Architects, where, let's say, with a sort of very can-do mentality, they have the ambition to sort of change the conventional way of building and to create carbon positive or buildings with a positive footprint. Not only carbon, but also positive footprint when it comes to air quality, soil quality, nature, and so forth. What's interesting here, also again looking not only as a sort of systemic side, but also at the type of architecture it can produce, is that at first, let's say, this attitude is perhaps most technical, but we also found examples of, let's say, not only technical innovation, but also an aesthetic innovation. Project by Marco Vermeulen is underway to be built, where we see solar panels along the highway, very visible, but it's a new generation of solar panels that comes in colors of red, yellow, green, to merge much more with the landscape. And after first there was a sort of revolution where solar panels became affordable and actually worked with a positive business case. Now the second revolution is coming, and it's that we're actually able to produce beautiful solar panels. And another example of this is a research center by NOAA Architects, also just a beautiful research lab where, let's say, future climate conditions are being researched. Last example here is of Philippe Risotti, that also found another way of avoiding, let's say, this technical approach, and it's a very thorough research on the classics in architecture and their carbon footprint. And it's super interesting actually because it showed that actually quite some buildings from 60 years ago didn't have a very large carbon footprint. And so it's also just about smart building, lightweight building, and smart use of materials. Very last project here is the research that we commissioned for the accelerator approach, because this is also the approach that could really lead to, let's say, game changers. That whereas maybe the activistic approach or the ancestral approach can stay at a small scale or maybe for too long, let's say this more systemic approach here has the opportunity to really go viral, to scale up. And we asked 250 Plus from Milan to come up with a research on this. And they did a project on synthetic meat, which is intriguing. They showed that actually the innovation curve goes very steep. That so this is a meat produced in a laboratory, but real meat, as an alternative for meat produced or let's say from cows or other cattle. And it's probably within a couple of years, it can be just in the supermarket when legislation allows it. And it's an affordable alternative for veal or pork. This would empty or a lot of land. 60% of all agricultural land worldwide is for meat production. Imagine all that being produced in sort of small production units. This could really open up the landscape for nature conservation and other initiatives. So this is a fantastic promise for the future that, of course, has large spatial consequences. Now, the question is, where are you? What is your role? What can be your role? Where are your where also does your personality lie or your qualities? This doesn't need to be in one of these specific containers, and in fact, in reality, many of these attitudes also overlay. And just as inspiration, one project, this is from Kongjiang Yu, where we found, let's say, the perfect combination of all three attitudes. And the story here, this is a landscape architect that studied in the States and then went back to China to then engage with the way Chinese cities were developing. And this was at that moment sort of just rolling out of concrete, steel and asphalt without taking much notice of the natural system that they were meeting. And he developed an alternative that he called Sponge City. And the sort of entry point here was to develop a sustainable water system that would, let's say, first absorb the water, keep it for as long as possible, and then to clean it, to then release it back to the natural system to avoid urban floodings. And this is a way to deal with water, but also a way to organize nature in the city, and also to offer sort of green space for residents. He came with this idea, and he worked on it really in three different ways. First, he started an office where he was actually developing a lot of innovations to make this principle actually happen in the Chinese context. You could say that's the accelerator approach, the innovative approach. As an ancestor, he started teaching at the Beijing University to also bring this philosophy to a new generation. And as an activist, he started to write to all mayors of all large cities in China and to the political leaders in Beijing. And after a flood happened in, 2014, where 70 people died in Beijing, actually his idea was adopted and turned into national policy. And now this is the standard rule in any development in a large city in China, is that you have to follow all these steps to deal with the water in a sustainable way. There's a book on this, but also important, with his office he created many sponge parks that are also just incredibly beautiful. Well, for me this is a very inspiring example of what one person can do. I hope this is also inspiring for you, and I would like to also have the discussion now. I hope you have questions. That was my presentation. We will close the online streaming, so you can feel free to also ask dumb questions, and I feel free to provide you with a dumb answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Is there anyone who has a question right now?